Hi, my name's Maya, and whenever I went over to a friend's house to celebrate Holi, Diwali, or any other celebration that involved dressing up, I'd wear a stylish salwar kameez. Or it could also be a itchy dress, which is the rite of passage for all women. Accompany that would be these golden shiny bangles that either pinch my skin as I shoved them on or would make eventually a ping on the ground when they fell off. And finally, really just for the sake of fashion, a bindi would be carefully placed on my forehead. But we all knew it would later, sooner or later, fall off because as children, those outfits didn't stop us from running around and playing. And as children, we didn't mind the elegant outfits or the excessive amount of jewelry because there was this camaraderie in having to get together and dress up just to celebrate these special events. See, the people I was around, most of us were of Indian origin or of Indian heritage. So there's this added comfort for me that the people I was around shared the similar mindsets and traditions as mine, except not everything was the same. See, some of the people that I was around, they would make references to certain Hindi or Bollywood movies that I'd never heard of. They would talk about certain holidays and traditions that my family never celebrated. They could, well, some of them at least, understand the language that their parents spoke, and they could also speak it, which is something I can't do. And it was from these experiences that I began to feel like that I wasn't Indian enough to call myself Indian, which is, well, let's just admit it, ridiculous. But I felt like that because these children were so much more expressive about their culture and they just seemed so much more knowledgeable about their traditions than I was. And it was from this that I began to feel inadequate to call myself Indian. So I had an identity crisis and it needed to be fixed. And one day I was lucky enough to be invited to this Indian cultural heritage class. And here we learned about the origins of gods and goddesses and these ancient poetic verses called shlokas in the language of Sanskrit. Now, I worked so hard to memorize these shlokas. I looked up recitations on YouTube. I got the help of my parents to help me pronounce each and every individual symbol correctly. I made sure to go through those symbols, making sure just to pronounce them correctly because I thought that if I could do that, then maybe I could justify my connection to this culture that I was beginning to feel disconnected from. And whenever my family members heard that I was going to recite these shlokas, they got so excited that they wanted me to recite in front of them. But every time this happened, I'd feel so nervous because I knew my pronunciation wasn't perfect. One time that comes to mind is when my grandmother came over from India and I was to recite for her and someone else. Now, for a little context, in my mind, my grandmother is top tier expert on Indian culture. So I wanted to make sure it was perfect down to every detail. And so, okay, here we go. Okay, deep breath in. I open my mouth and I get through the first line. And suddenly I hear, without malicious intent, and just simply as a joke, what's up with your accent? And I froze. A deer in the headlight. Shame and guilt rising, disappointment washing over me, all the effort that I had put into memorizing these shlokas forgotten because I'd been hampered by my American accent. And I thought maybe I'd be able to justify it. Maybe I could justify my connection, but it was from this joke, this useless joke and comments that I felt this reminded me of all the people who could judge me and act like they had a say in my cultural identity. But enough of that. You want to know what my grandmother said? Well, she gleamed at me, proud of her granddaughter's effort. And I wish I'd focused on that day instead of this useless comment, because otherwise I felt so shut off and shut down from ever trying to learn any of my parents' languages. And eventually I came along this term, ABCD. No, not the alphabet. It's actually a term that originated from a movie called American Born Confused Daisy. And if ever told to anyone of Indian origin or South Asian heritage, you'd probably hear a peeved "oh" or a shrug. But for those of you who don't know what it is, let me explain. So Desi refers to those of the South Asian diaspora. The whole term is directed at those of South Asian heritage, the children growing up in America of South Asian heritage, suggesting that they are disconnected and utterly confused about their roots. For me, it carries this idea that I can't claim the terms South Asian, Indian, or Desi because of my American cultural identity. And at a time when I couldn't put into words the feeling of being pushed and pulled between two cultures, I knew I needed more role models who looked like me. But the books and the movies that I read and watched, they couldn't give me that. See, the thing is, South Asian representation wasn't totally eliminated from what I watched when I was younger, but the few characters and narratives that I saw portrayed the same stereotypical story. This Indian kid who loves STEM, is dedicated to becoming a doctor or an engineer, has a horrible time pursuing a love interest, and is an absolute expert on their culture. Look here, needless to say, it's problematic because these stereotypes showed me how I'm viewed in America and how other people probably expect me to behave. And turning to Hindi and Bollywood movies, it didn't help me either, because what I saw were the same stereotypes portrayed in those movies, and including that, the characters in those movies didn't grow up in the same environments that I'm growing up in. And it was from this I began to wonder maybe my American and Indian cultural identities couldn't coexist. Now, as a quick question, a little off topic, what do you do when you're a little frustrated, slightly anxious? Maybe you want to take all of those feelings and just crunch them up into a little ball and then chuck them away. Well, essentially, that's what I did. I took all these feelings and I threw them to the back of my brain. Not because I didn't care. I cared so much. I really did. But at this point, I felt too disconnected and too alone in my disconnection to really begin to figure this out. But the funny part is, I focused so much on my disconnection that I forgot to look at all the ways I already was connected. A little while ago, I attended my cousin's thread ceremony. For those of you who don't know, it's kind of like this coming of age ceremony, traditionally for boys, to symbolize the next step in their pursuit for formal education. At this one part, we are to recite this mantra. So we are given this booklet with a Hindi and an English translation. And so I looked down at this booklet and little bubbles of joy floated up inside of me. These little bubbles of joy. Because I could recognize, and it's not a lot, but I could recognize two symbols from the Hindi translation side. And it was at this moment I realized that I didn't need any sort of justification for why I could claim Indian as part of my cultural identity. I didn't need to, no matter how big or small connection that I had to this identity, it was good enough. And from this, I could claim, if I wanted to, both American and Indian as part of my cultural identity. It doesn't matter what anyone else says. And so I chose both. And choosing both is something I work on a lot, because for so long, I've been trying to color inside of lines that complete strangers have drawn for me and that I once made bold. But after seeing so many people open up about struggles of their bicultural identity, I know I can navigate through mine. So now to you. What journey did it take for you to navigate through your multicultural and multi-ethnic identity? Thank you.